Okay, hello and welcome. I'm Diane Chantal from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining today's congressional briefing to talk about the affordable housing crisis before, during, and after COVID-19. We're going to talk about some of the National Low Income Housing Coalition's recent research quantifying the shortage of affordable homes for the lowest income people. We're going to hear about its impacts on people directly impacted, on Black and Brown renters across the country, and we're going to hear about the solutions and what we can do to achieve them. So I appreciate you all joining today, and we have a terrific lineup of speakers, and I'm grateful to all of them for taking time to join us today. And I'm going to jump right in and introduce our first speaker. We're very honored to have Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio join us today. Senator Brown serves as the ranking member on the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And in this role, he's been a tremendously strong champion of expanding investments in affordable housing, especially for people with the lowest incomes. Senator Brown was key to securing $12 billion in emergency housing funds through the CARES Act to respond to the urgent needs from the pandemic. And most recently, Senator Brown has led the push for truly essential protections to ensure housing stability for the lowest income renters, including his Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act, which would provide $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, and in co-sponsoring the Protecting Renters from Evictions Act to expand the federal eviction moratorium. These are the National Low Income Housing Coalition's top priorities for the next COVID-19 relief bill. Senator Brown has always been a tremendous champion for low-income people and low-income renters, and we're especially grateful for his leadership and tireless efforts right now to prevent this wave of eviction that's otherwise coming for low-income renters. So Senator Brown, thank you as always for your tremendous leadership, and thank you for joining today.
And you too, Ms. Yentl. Diane Yentl has been just the superstar advocate in the country for housing, for low-income housing, especially understanding that underpinning everyone's life is safe and affordable access to housing, and access to safe, affordable housing. And everything goes wrong if you lose your home, and especially in the midst of a pandemic, we can see with unemployment about to expire, and Senator McConnell doing so far nothing about it. With eviction, I'll talk more about this in a moment. Eviction courts opening up, the moratoria on the incomplete moratoria, if you will, on foreclosures and evictions, and the perfect storm of so many more people being homeless in the midst of a pandemic, whether they go to overcrowded shelters or they go to sleep in their cousins' basements. We know what that would mean for the coronavirus spread. So the work that you all are doing, the congressional staff in this call, the advocates in this call, the work you're doing in the House and Senate and outside, putting pressure in the House and Senate, and the work that you're about to do as the pressure really builds on McConnell to actually do something. Those of you that helped get the bill through the House and the HEROES Act, thank you. The language that Ms. Yentl and I and others worked on jointly with you and your bosses, if you will, in the House, really mattered as the template for where we need to go. My new friend, but longtime acquaintance, directly, indirectly, President Johnson, the NAACP, is calling from his home in Mississippi. Understand he grew up in Michigan, so he grew up in my part of the country, and now is meeting the challenges nationally, the NAACP. President Johnson, good to see you again. And Ms. Woods from Seattle, who is a more recent but an amazing advocate for housing. And thank you, Ms. Woods, for joining us from across the country. As I said, Diana, the National Low Income Housing Coalition is so important. Thanks for putting a report together each year that we will talk about. The data in out of reach has always been important. It's something we look forward to and need every year. We had a housing crisis, as all of you know that have been advocates or that are congressional staff know that the housing crisis was here long before the coronavirus. The pandemic, though, has been the great revealer. Again, you all knew this on this call. You knew what racial disparities meant in housing. You know the history of Jim Crow and redlining and Trump administration locking in discriminatory practices through their rules, their behavior, their interpretation of the law. America now understands those racial disparities better than it ever has in terms of wealth generation or generational wealth, in terms of housing, in terms of the digital divides in our schools and in our communities generally, and in terms of everything from life expectancy to maternal mortality to infant mortality. You have wrestled with these issues. I think the American public, this isn't about the elections in November, but I think the American public sees that more directly and more viscerally, and it means that you will see action in January, particularly when we consult with people like President Johnson and Ms. Chantal on things like the Out of Reach report and beyond what we do next year. But the immediacy of now is especially important. As before this pandemic, I think President Trump and his wealthy cabinet members didn't realize or didn't care that behind the rosy stock market data, this economy was broken for millions of workers, and for Black and brown workers, it really never worked for so many of them to begin with. The NLIHC knows so well. We're still living with the legacy of redlining and racial covenants. We're still living with housing segregation and discrimination. The zip code, and Ms. Chantal's heard me say this probably ad nauseum, the zip code my wife and I live in Cleveland, where I'm calling from right now, and first half of 2007 had more foreclosures than any zip code in the United States of America. And I still see in my neighborhood, in this zip code, and on the southeast side of Cleveland, still see obviously the damage done by bad housing policy over the years. As Out of Reach demonstrates, many of the professions we're now calling essential just don't pay enough to afford housing. An essential grocery store worker in Southwest Ohio told me maybe 6-8 weeks ago, said, they call me essential, but I really do feel expendable because they don't pay me much and they don't protect me at work. We know that thousands of grocery store workers have been infected by this virus. Dozens of grocery store workers have died. We know they live with the fear at work. Essential workers, whether they're bus drivers, whether they clean hospital rooms, whether they work at a grocery store or meat packing plant, or are the custodians or the security or the food service people. We know they go to work knowing they can expose the virus and live with the anxiety when they go home of potentially infecting their families. And we also know that a quarter of all renters, prior to the pandemic, a quarter of all renters were paying half their income in housing. Means one thing goes wrong in their life, their car breaks down to get to work, their child gets sick and needs to stay home a few days from school, and they don't have sick pay and sick leave in their workplace, or if they get hurt on the job and miss just a week, that everything can go upside down and they lose their place. That's why we're seeing millions of people have those emergencies, in essence, having those emergencies all at once. We have to make sure we don't emerge, and Diane, I talked just for a moment about this before, we don't emerge from this crisis. We have to make sure we don't emerge from this crisis with these, that we don't have this same, even worse, issues of segregation and disparities and all. We have to make sure that we face right now 2 huge cliffs at the end of the month. First of all, as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, unemployment insurance, the $600 federal payments, $600 a week, end at the end of July. Senator McConnell has so far, President Trump has so far shown no interest in renewing them, shown little interest even in their existence. It was the only amendment that Republicans in the Senate brought forward, was to eliminate the $600 back in March. So we know what they think. The other huge cliff, of course, is that the moratorium will be lifted. We know UI benefits don't reach everyone. We know that the moratorium doesn't reach all renters, doesn't reach all people. Families in Ohio and across the country are clearly feeling this urgency. As they reopen eviction courts all over the country, in Columbus, in my state, they opened the convention center to process evictions. They opened a convention center to process evictions. That's how serious this problem is. families are going to find themselves in the street with their lives turned upside down in the middle of a pandemic. That's why we have to act. Dr. King once, one of my favorite Dr. King quotes is in the middle of the letter from the Birmingham jail. And Senator Jones asked a half dozen of his colleagues to read that letter. We took turns reading on the Senate floor the letter from the Birmingham jail, the 1963. Beautiful work of literature by Dr. King with a very strong message. And his quote that I got to read that I always loved is Dr. King said, "Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability." Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It rolls in because of the activists on this call. It rolls in because of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and the fight against poverty. It's so important that what NLIHC does, the Out of Reach report, all of those things matter. We're learning now, fortunately, maybe fortunately, that Senator McConnell's finally getting around to assembling an economic recovery package. He's months behind. Surely we should have done this soon after the first one passed in March. We believe that we'd be working on it in April and May with something significant as a result. So far not, but it means we keep the pressure on McConnell, we keep the pressure on Trump, we keep the pressure on my colleagues in the Senate to pass something as close as possible to the HEROES Act. It will matter in keeping people in their homes. It will matter for people feeding their families. It will matter for people being able to return to work at a decent level of income. And it will matter for them raising their children and keeping people alive. So Diane, thank you for allowing me to be part of this. We know the cost of inaction is too great. That's why we keep putting the pressure on. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Brown, so much. And once again, I really appreciate your leadership on these essential issues. And we're behind you and look forward to continuing to work with you in the coming weeks, months, and years to actually end homelessness and housing poverty once and for all. So thank you, Senator Brown. So we're going to turn now to Dan Threet, who is a research analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and he is going to walk us through some of the key findings from the Out of Reach report. Dan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Afternoon all. Once I have control of the screen here, I will jump right to it. So this year, in the midst of an ongoing public health and economic crisis, we find evidence that decent housing is still out of reach for low-wage workers. Out of Reach is an annual publication that highlights the gulf between the wages that people earn and the price of decent rental housing in every state, metropolitan area, and county in the United States. The central statistic in the report, the housing wage, represents what a full-time worker would need to earn in order to be able to afford rent and utilities at fair market rent. Now, there are two assumptions built into the housing wage that I want to explain before we get into the numbers. First, when we talk about what a household can afford, we're relying on the assumption, which is also reflected in federal housing policy, that no more than 30% of a household's gross income should be consumed by housing costs. Second, when we talk about the rent for decent or modest housing, that reflects that we rely on HUD's fair market rents, or FMRs, to estimate what a household moving today could expect to pay for rental housing. Each year, HUD produces fair market rents for every metropolitan area and county across the country. The base rent in an FMR is typically set at the 40th percentile of standard quality gross rents. So these are rents for homes below the middle of the market, not for what we might call luxury housing. The national average housing wage for a two-bedroom apartment this year is $23.96 an hour, and the housing wage for a one-bedroom apartment is $19.56 an hour. The hourly wage for renters, however, is just $18.22 an hour. And of course, minimum wages everywhere are lower. While there is variation across the country in housing costs and minimum wages, nowhere in America do minimum wage full-time workers earn the two-bedroom housing wage for their area. Now, on the next slide, you can see some interstate variation in the housing wage. The two-bedroom housing wage ranges from $14.19 an hour in Arkansas all the way up to $38.76 an hour in Hawaii. There are persistently high housing costs on the West Coast, Florida, New York, New Jersey. But states with lower housing costs are generally also areas with lower wages. While Arkansas's two-bedroom housing wage is $14.19 an hour, the average renter in the state earns $13.92 an hour. There is also considerable variation by metropolitan area, as you can see on this next slide. You can see pockets of dark blue around Austin, San Francisco, and New York City and other areas. This map shows how many hours a minimum wage worker must work to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment. In the dark blue areas, a minimum wage worker would need to work more than 80 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, in order to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment. But this is not a problem that's just confined to a handful of small metros. In fact, in fewer than 5% of counties nationwide, can a minimum wage worker with a standard 40-hour work week afford a one-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. On average, a minimum wage worker needs to work 79 hours a week, all year round, to afford a one-bedroom. Now, Out of Reach compares the housing wages to what workers across the country are actually earning, using surveys conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. One striking finding in this year's report is that 12 of the 20 largest occupations in the country have median hourly wages less than the national one- and two-bedroom housing wage. You can see at the bottom of this chart that food and beverage serving workers make $11.24 an hour on average, and retail sales workers make $12.08 an hour. Home health aides at $12.94 are not much better off. And many of these low-wage workers have been profoundly affected by the COVID-19 shutdowns as well. Pulling back from specific occupations, you can see how out of reach housing is by comparing the housing wages to the national hourly wage distribution. Now, this includes all wage and salary workers. The blue bars here are actual wages by percentile. So the 10th percentile, or the first blue bar, is the lowest 10% of wages. The 20th percentile is the lowest 20% of wages, and so on. The 50th percentile hourly wage of $19.68 an hour is just barely over the one-bedroom housing wage of $19.56. And to be clear, nearly half of all workers make less than $19.68 an hour. The two-bedroom housing wage is higher than what 60% of all workers earn. And remember that the average wage for renter households is actually even lower, at $18.22 an hour. The average renter's wage is insufficient to afford a one-bedroom in 51% of all counties nationwide. And it's insufficient for a two-bedroom apartment in 85% of US counties. You can find housing cost data for every state, metropolitan area, and county on our website, which is nlihc.org/OOR. The landing page has a map, and when you click through, you can find considerably more local information. Now, the pandemic, of course, has had a profound impact on the economy, and the housing wages in this year's report reflect data that were collected before the pandemic. So the report this year amply shows that even before the crisis, during a period of much lower unemployment, low-wage workers were struggling to afford their rent. This is a long-term structural problem that's been greatly exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. Our other annual report, The Gap, calculates the shortage of rental homes or apartments for the lowest income renters. So it tells us how many affordable apartments or rental homes are needed. Now, there's a lot on this chart, but approximately 11 million extremely low-income households rent in the US. You can see that at the far left. ELI households, or extremely low-income households, earn no more than 30% of their area's median income, or the poverty guideline. Nationally, 7.3 million apartments or rental homes are affordable to them. But many of those homes on the private market are occupied by higher income households. So there are really only about 4 million apartments that are both affordable and available for extremely low income renters. So we have a shortage of about 7 million apartments for these renters. Every state and major metropolitan area and most counties have a shortage. Another way to see this is by looking at the number of apartments or rental homes that are affordable and available for every 100 households. There are only 36 affordable and available rental units for every 100 ELI household who rents. As a result of that shortage, nearly 86% of extremely low-income renters are what we call housing cost burdened. They spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And more than 70% are severely cost burdened, meaning they spend more than half of their income on rent. That has significant consequences for their ability to pay for other necessities and maintain stable housing. ELI renters account for about 72% of all severely cost-burdened renters in the country. No state has an adequate supply of rental housing for the lowest income renters, as shown by this map here. The supply ranges from about 18 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 ELI renter households in Nevada, up to 62 for every 100 in West Virginia. No major metropolitan area has an adequate supply either, ranging from only 14 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 ELI renter households in Las Vegas, Nevada, and in Austin, Texas, up to 54 affordable and available for every 100 ELI renter households in Providence, Rhode Island. So in sum, we know that for years, millions of extremely low-income households have not been able to find affordable rental housing and do not receive the housing assistance they need. Now, in the wake of a pandemic that's underscored why stable housing is a matter of life and death, we expect that low-wage workers and low-income households more broadly will struggle even more than before to afford their rent. And I'll pass this back to Diane now.
Thanks so much, Dan. So I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, who I'm just so pleased to have with us today, which is Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. And Derek is a veteran activist who has dedicated his career to defending the rights and improving the lives of Black Americans since his time as the state president of the NAACP Mississippi State Conference, which is where I first met him 15 years ago. Today, he leads the national NAACP, the largest and most preeminent civil rights organization in the nation, with over 2,200 units and branches across the nation, as well as over 2 million activists. And Derek is here today to talk about the disproportionate harm that the affordable housing crisis does to Black Americans. So Derek, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your leadership, and I'll turn it over to you.
Good. Thank you, Diane. And just want to say for everyone who's on, Diane and I, we met in the aftermath of Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina for both Mississippi and Louisiana exposed the problem with the lack of quality housing for individuals who work every day, but who happen to get paid the lowest wages on the scale. And unfortunately, we began to build a lot of clarity around this issue, because when you look in the face of individuals, whether they're seniors or children, in their home, albeit not the best housing stock in some scenarios, no longer exists, what do you tell that family? What do you tell that child? How do you console that senior who may have given all of their most vibrant years to a workforce that was not kind in terms of the level of wages and income? And here we are sitting in this same scenario today in many cases. But the biggest difference is, as opposed to that being a regionalized disaster, we're looking at a national disaster. And so for the NAACP, we really appreciate our partnership with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and especially look forward to the annual release of the Out of Reach report, which truly highlight and document the gaps. I would not go through the numbers we just heard Dan present, but we are in the midst of a crisis. The federal foreclosure and eviction moratorium expires at the end of next month, and we're going to need action. And if we don't get action from Congress, we're going to see an unfortunate sharp increase in the homeless population. During the time when the spread of the virus has not only not been contained in this country, unfortunately, but if you create a scenario where people lose their home, it is almost impossible for them to social distance. There is no cure on the horizon. So where we had individuals in an administration early on assuming that the summer will contain the virus or assume that the virus is going to magically disappear, we don't address this housing crisis, we're going to see an acceleration. That acceleration will be compounded with young children who in many school districts are going to be required to go back to school, impacting so many of the children in ways in which it will put our whole nation at risk, more so than what we currently see. It is an urgent need. African Americans are overrepresented in the essential frontline workers delivering services. And I'm going to underscore that because oftentimes when you're talking about low-income housing, you're thinking about individuals who are trying to game the system, somehow are not fully participating. But these are individuals who work every day. Many of us on this call rely on these individuals. We see them every day. We may see them on Capitol Hill working and sweep of the floor. We may see them as they pick us up in taxi cabs or even Ubers in many cases. We will see them as we go to fast food restaurants. It is an invisible workforce, but an essential workforce. And so we're not talking about people who lack the work ethic to get up and go to work. These are individuals who do some of the most physically challenging jobs you can think of, but are underpaid or their pay is not keeping up with the expense of housing. And for African Americans who get sick and cannot work, they are then hit with a double whammy because many of these jobs, they lack any type of medical insurance support. They lack very little in terms of paid sick leave. And
I think, did we lose Derek? He's frozen on my
we
screen.
did not have this workforce in place. The discomfort many people would be confronted with go beyond the essential workers. It would impact our entire economy. Think about the meat processing facility workers. And those are many of the individuals we're talking about. They're underpaid, they work very hard. A large percentage of them, if not majority, are not members of any type of organized bargaining unit. And so they have no voice, and all they have is hard work. And if those workers can not go to work and our meat packing facilities, as an example, shut down, many of us on this Zoom will be unable to purchase food to feed our families. That's important. These are individuals who work in agricultural concerns. They work every day. They work harder than most of us on this call. And if those individuals can no longer work because they're sick, and they're sick because they lost housing, and they lost housing because the wages that they are paid has not kept pace with the cost of rent. And as a result of that, they found themselves homeless. That's a problem not for them, that's a problem for greater society. Households should not spend more than 30% of their income towards housing. And depending on where one lives, that is the reality. And in some cases, people are paying upwards of 50% of their income on housing. One zip code should not be the determining factors for success. And unfortunately, that is also the reality. The zip code will determine not only the quality of your housing, but the access to health care and the quality of the education your children are provided. And because of the gap with transportation, it also determines the quality of jobs that are available to you. More affordable housing options are key to bridging the health disparities in this country. Access to health care has been a persistent problem in the African American community, and it's all based on housing. It all based on housing. African Americans make up 13% of the country's population, but represent 40% of the homeless population before COVID. I can only imagine what the numbers will be if we don't get an extension next month. We need the $11.5 billion in emergency homeless assistance grant from the HEROES Act to prevent an even greater homeless crisis. To prevent an even greater homeless crisis. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, homeownership statistics for the first quarter of 2020, the homeownership rate for Blacks in this country is 44% compared to 73% whites. And that is not even speaking to the housing, the quality of the housing stock for the 44%. This disparity reveals the need to increase Black homeownership rate by providing down payment and tax credit incentives. You want to spur the economy, allow for more home ownership. You can allow for more home ownership by making sure that there are programs in place. And you think about the growth of home ownership in this country, it's not about individuals who pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. It is about federal programs, FHA being the lead for federal programs that open the door to accelerate the growth of home ownership and thus to accelerate the opportunity to grow a true middle class. We're not asking for anything more than what has been a proven track record of successful public policy, but that track record needs to be expanded for the African American community, but also expanded for workers who work every day and are underpaid. The pandemic has pulled back the veil of rising inequities in this country, just like Danielle and Diane and I identified during Hurricane Katrina. Is only exposing what exists, but because of that exposure, we have an opportunity to change what exists. African Americans make up the largest percentage of low-wage earners in the country. The federal minimum wage of $7.25 does not keep pace with inflation. It has never kept pace. And if you live in the South, you still have states to fight against the reality of providing the basic minimum wage. There is no state in this country where a worker earning minimum wage can afford a modest 2-bedroom rental at fair market rent. Even in cities that have increased the minimum wage, it has not kept pace with the cost of living, particularly rent, whether it's New York or San Francisco. Eliminating the housing affordability problem requires a sustained commitment to rental housing programs from the federal government and an increase in federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And we just seen on the slide what averages $23 an hour for a decent house, and we're fighting for $15 an hour. So as we continue to advocate for a living wage, 29 states and the District of Columbia, which should be a state, by the way, that's my side note there, have increased their minimum wage while the other states continue to follow the federal minimum wage, which has not been raised in over 10 years. We must do more for those who work so hard to ensure the comfort that many of us have grown accustomed to, that we can really appreciate those individuals. Because those are the individuals that do the work that many of us have, our families, we have grown beyond doing. And as a result of their sacrifice, their labor, we enjoy a different comfort level. We should afford them the same opportunity through this HEROES Act so we can have a more just and equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. Really powerful words, and I appreciate I appreciate your leadership for decades, and I appreciate the partnership with the NAACP and with you, and I appreciate you being on today. Thank you. Before I turn to our next speaker, I just want to let everybody know that time permitting, we will do some questions live, either verbally or in the chat box, in the Q&A box, sorry. So if you do have questions of any of our speakers, please put them in the Q&A box. And if we have time, we'll ask them out loud. And if not, the team at the National Low Income Housing Coalition will be answering your questions as we go. So I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, who I'm delighted to introduce, Mindy Woods. She is a steering committee member of the Resident Action Project, which is a tenant advocate organization fighting for housing to be a human right in Washington State. Mindy is also a board member of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and she has used her lived experience of homelessness to build power for change and to create the opportunity for everybody to have a home. So Mindy, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Diane. Again, my name is Mindy Woods, and I live just north of Seattle in Washington State. And a little bit about me, I'm a single mom, a Navy veteran, and 9 years ago, my then 13-year-old son and I experienced homelessness for the first time when we had an apartment building that was taken over by black mold. And we lived in a shelter, we lived in a motel, we couch surfed for 8 months until we were able to get stabilized in our apartment. And we were getting our lives back on track. And then 3.5 years later, our apartment manager decided to no longer accept our Section 8 rental assistance voucher. So we began our 20-day search for a new place, which is the law in Washington State, which is a very short period of time for anybody. But at that time, I was very ill, had a lot of health issues, and was on Social Security disability. And so anyway, the 20-day period ran out, and we were faced with homelessness again. So at that point, I made the heartbreaking decision to place my son with another family so he could have stability. And I began another 8-month experience of homelessness where I couch surfed again, and with 4 different families, and really just did everything I could to try to get that roof over my head again. And then was finally able to find the apartment that I am currently living in. So I am stabilized now as a low income renter, have that Section 8 voucher, and I'm so grateful for that. But then just earlier this year, COVID hit in Washington State. We were my county, just 15 minutes north of me, was the first documented case in the United States, and quickly spread throughout our county and our neighboring county, King County. And I then contracted COVID, and I got very sick, and I kept thinking the whole time that I was in quarantine and in my home, what if I didn't have this home right now? I could not imagine trying to, feeling as bad as I did, trying to stay quarantined from other people, trying to get healthy again and take care of myself, and not have the ability to be in my own place. And I quickly started getting calls from other people who were unable to pay their rent because they had lost their job. Our state went into a shutdown. And so people were starting to call me knowing that I was an advocate, and I didn't know what to tell them. And ironically, my city started a new human services department and needed somebody with lived experience, who had connections, who was able to find those resources for people. So just the day after I got out of quarantine, I was hired by the city to be their first human services program manager. And I cannot tell you, my days are absolutely filled, well beyond the number of hours in a day, with folks trying to find resources. We've had an outbreak in several shelters within our 2-county area. So shelters are shut down. Those that are open are only at half capacity because of trying to keep people safe distance from each other. We just had our point in time count numbers come out 2 weeks ago. Our numbers have gone up in my county and in King County, where Seattle is. Just trying to wrap my head around how we are allowing people to not only live outside in the middle of a pandemic, but also knowing that we have our eviction moratorium is going to be lifted on August 1st. Seattle alone is 1/2 renters in the city of Seattle. In the month of June for Washington State, 12% of renters that participated in census data collection were unable to pay their rent for June. We are now in the almost over the halfway mark of July, and my day is spent getting phone calls from people who may have never needed assistance before, lost their job, unable to get unemployment, or had a small business, couldn't get the business loan. Maybe they already were low income, already were experiencing housing instability, can't find food, are unable to even get a COVID test, don't have anywhere to isolate and protect themselves and keep the others that they may live with safe. And I just implore our members of Congress to look at what is coming down the pike if we do not provide a nationwide uniform eviction moratorium that is going to extend to the end of our year at least, but also a $100 billion rental assistance and rental market stabilization act, because I live in a building, a small 32 unit apartment building, and I talk to my landlord all the time, and she's very concerned if those of us renters can't pay our rent, then she's out of business. And we cannot afford to lose any more affordable units on the market. We are already, Washington State's the 6th highest in the housing instability market as far as the rates of rents. $2,500 for a 2-bedroom apartment, and you would need to make $30.46 an hour to be able to afford that 2-bedroom modest apartment. My son is a 23-year-old young man of color. He worked in a restaurant, and as soon as the state shut down, that restaurant job ended, so he went to work on the front lines as a grocery store clerk. He also lives with a Latino family where all of the adults in that family have to work. They cannot afford not to. Our unemployment, is ending that protection. So they're all working and trying to scrape together and keep that roof over their head. And they know that they are at the highest risk of not only having the lack of access to healthcare, but at also highest risk of contracting COVID or any other health disparate in disease, but also they're the lowest wage of wage earners in the country. And so 5 adults pooling their money together to try to keep a roof over their head and try to stay well in the middle of this pandemic. And so I just implore you to keep people safe. And if we look at our most vulnerable, those with disabilities, those that are seniors that are retired, single parents with children, people of color are disproportionately affected by not only health disparities, but also by homelessness, as Derek pointed out. So if we look at our most vulnerable population and take care of them, then everybody else will be okay as well. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mindy. I really appreciate your remarks and your leadership. And I'm so glad to have had you on the call today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the policy solutions, and also want to talk about how it all fits together, what we know is at stake right now in this moment. So Out of Reach makes clear that even before the coronavirus, the country was in the grips of a pervasive affordable housing crisis. Over 500,000 people experienced homelessness on any given night. Over 8 million of the lowest income families paid at least half of their limited income on rent, and many paid much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And so when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it for your home, you are always one financial emergency away from missing rent and potentially being evicted, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many of these same renters, the coronavirus is that financial emergency. More than half of low-income households have experienced a recent and sudden decline in income or job loss. In the first week of July, only 74% of renters in older, lower-cost apartments were able to pay rent. And many of those who did paid it with one-time stimulus checks or with credit cards, both of which are unsustainable. People of color are most at risk of eviction, and while the current crises have heightened the threat to Black and brown renters, it's not new. Structural racism leaves people of color disproportionately low income, disproportionately rent burdened, disproportionately likely to be homeless. And these inequities compound the harm done by COVID-19. Black and Native Americans are bearing the brunt of infections and fatalities, and Latino and Black people are bearing the brunt of historic job losses. Now, their homes, and with it, their ability to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy, are at risk. Federal, state, and local eviction moratoriums provided important protections for some renters, but they are expiring rapidly, and landlords and courts are beginning to evict. By the first week of July, 29 governors lifted their eviction moratoriums, and now we're seeing a horrifying confluence of increasing evictions in states where new coronavirus cases are surging. So in Tucson, Arizona, for example, a current hotspot for new COVID-19 cases, courts are processing 3 times as many evictions as compared to the same time last year. In Houston, another hotspot for coronavirus, courts are holding over 2,000 eviction hearings via Zoom. In Columbus, Ohio, they've turned their local convention center into an eviction court in order to handle the influx. In Denver, the mayor is making plans for supported campsites in order to manage the increase in homelessness from evictions. And even in these places, evictions are not now as bad as they will become, because federal eviction moratoriums continue to protect about 30% of renters across the country in every state. But those federal eviction moratoriums expire next week. So some communities have cobbled together resources from the CARES Act to provide rental assistance and avoid some evictions, but many of them are having to shut down programs within hours or days after the funds are quickly depleted. Just yesterday, the city of Los Angeles opened a 1-week application window for its rental assistance programs. They have enough funding to offer short-term assistance to 50,000 people in Los Angeles. Over 100,000 people applied in the first day. In the state of Indiana, the state had to close down applications for rental assistance after 1 day when they received twice as many applicants as they have funding to support. The same happened in the city of Houston after 90 minutes. I understand that in New York, when they opened up their application, it crashed their entire website within 3 minutes of opening. So the need is extraordinary, and the demand is clearly overwhelming resources throughout the country. And now keep in mind that these evictions that are already underway, these quickly depleted rental assistance funds, this is with expanded unemployment insurance in place, right? So the expanded unemployment insurance benefits are very important, and they're likely what's prevented far more evictions over the past months, but it is not enough on its own. Millions of people haven't received unemployment, even though they need it and may be eligible for it. Millions more find that even with unemployment insurance funds, it's not enough to offset the exorbitant cost of rent, especially as other costs increase: childcare, healthcare, food. So as rental assistance programs are depleted and eviction moratoriums expire, it is very clear that without a significant federal intervention, there will be a wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness across the country. And in fact, the wave has already begun. And now we need to work to prevent it from becoming a tsunami, and we are running out of time. This imminent tsunami of evictions and all the harmful outcomes that come are both entirely predictable and completely preventable. Congress should immediately implement a uniform national moratorium on evictions for the duration of the public health emergency and provide at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. Together, these essential protections will stem the tide of evictions in our country. Also, Congress has to provide additional funding to homeless shelter and service providers to respond to and prevent outbreaks among people experiencing homelessness. People who are homeless and contract the coronavirus are twice as likely to be hospitalized, 2 to 4 times as likely to require critical care, and 2 to 3 times as likely to die as housed people are. This has enormous implications for individual people, for their communities, and for our already overstretched hospital systems. So the U.S. House of Representatives has responded to this urgent need for action by passing essential housing and homelessness protections, not just once, but twice, in both the HEROES Act and the Emergency Housing Protections and Relief Act. Senator Brown, Senator Warren, and other Democrats have introduced and co-sponsored multiple essential bills to provide housing stability during the pandemic. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has refused to take up any of these bills or to offer any of his own. So the stakes could not be higher during this public health crisis. Every day of inaction puts more low-income seniors, people with disabilities, families with kids at immediate risk of losing their homes. Evicting families during a pandemic is not only cruel and immoral, it's short-sighted and senseless. Evictions risk lives. They drive families deeper into poverty. They further burden overstretched hospital system and make it much more difficult for the country to contain the virus. So ensuring that everybody is stably housed during and after the pandemic is not only a moral imperative, it is a public health necessity. And after Congress has stemmed the tide of evictions, it needs to go much further. The immediate housing crisis that we're working to prevent sits on top of a long-standing and pervasive shortage of affordable homes throughout the country. And unless Congress is willing to make sustained and substantial investments in long-term solutions, then we will face the same crisis again during the next pandemic, the next wave of this pandemic, or even just the next year, because we still will not have solved for the underlying shortage of affordable homes for the lowest income people. And the long-term solutions too are simple, even if they're not easy. We need significant and sustained funding to build apartments affordable to the lowest income people through the National Housing Trust Fund. We need to bridge the gap between what people earn and what rent costs through rental assistance like Section 8 vouchers. We need to provide cash assistance and eviction prevention to stabilized families through a financial emergency. And of course, we have to preserve our country's existing public housing and other affordable housing stock. So allowing homelessness and housing poverty to exist in our country has always been a public policy choice, and we can choose otherwise. We have the data, we have the solutions. Certainly as a country, we have the resources. The only thing we lack, what we have always lacked, is the political will to fund the solutions at the scale necessary. And now, when it's never been more clear that housing is housing is healthcare, now is the time to act. So we have 2 more speakers that I want to turn to now, who are going to share public polling data that shows just how strongly the public supports these essential solutions to the emergency and the long-term housing crisis. And so I'm going to turn to Chantal Wilkinson and Mike Kapowski from our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. Chantal is the campaign's coordinator and Mike is its director. And I will go ahead and turn to you first. Chantal, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. I'm going to make sure that I have control of the screen here. There we go. So thank you, Diane, for that. We recently conducted a national opinion poll through Hart Research Associates. They are a leading polling firm to extensively assess the extent to which people are worried about housing during this time, the extent to which they want action from Congress, and which types of specific policies they favor. This poll is demographically and geographically representative of adults nationwide based on US Census data. And what we found is that Americans are deeply concerned about housing instability as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. Over half of all people in this country say they are concerned that they will lose their housing if they don't get additional resources. And this large number is especially acute among renters and people of color. And based on other questions that we had in our poll, we saw that the concern has grown since the start of the outbreak. And so another question we really wanted to explore is whether people were making sacrifices in other areas just to afford their rent or mortgage. It's an important question to see where people are making trade-offs at this time in order to afford their rent and or mortgage. And so we found that nearly half, 46% of the public, reported that they had to make at least one sacrifice since the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak to make sure they could pay for their rent or mortgage. And this includes things like cutting back on healthy foods, stopping retirement savings, using a credit card to cover their housing costs, borrowing money from friends, skipping on their water or electric bills. And these aren't trivial sacrifices. These are highly consequential sacrifices that really impact the well-being of Americans in this country. And so we also asked about the existing unemployment benefits that some people are receiving under the CARES Act. The survey found that among those who applied for unemployment benefits, a significant portion, 3 in 10, do not believe that unemployment benefits will cover their basic living expenses, and that included their housing costs over the next several months. And so these results strongly suggest that rental assistance is going to be required in the next package to ensure that we keep people stably housed. And on this slide, you'll see that the majorities of Democrats, Republicans, Independents believe it's important for government to provide housing assistance during the pandemic. You'll see that even amongst conservative Republicans, they see a role for government in providing housing assistance during this time. And in this slide, you'll see that nearly 8 in 10 agree that our elected leaders are not putting enough attention on people's needs to help to pay for their housing during the coronavirus outbreak. So now I'm going to turn it over to Mike Kapowski, and he's going to speak more to the solutions that we tested, we surveyed through the poll.
Great, thanks, Chantal. Hey, everybody. So I'll be brief here, and we'll get right to the solutions. So, certainly the main counter argument that you hear against another robust relief package is concern over the deficit. So we wanted to see what the American people thought about that. So we gave people 2 different statements and asked them which one they agreed with more, even if it wasn't exactly how they feel. So, I mean, you can read the statements for yourself, but basically statement A says that the government should make major housing investments during the outbreak and through the recovery, even if it means increasing the deficit. And then statement B basically says the opposite, which is that we've already spent, $2.5 trillion in aid. People will be back to work soon. We can't afford to go deeper into debt and increase the deficit because it'll hurt the economy and burden future generations. So personally, I thought this was going to be about a 50-50 split, that once we invoked language about the deficit, I really thought the Democrats would go for statement A and Republicans would go for statement B. What we saw, though, was pretty surprising. By a 2-to-1 margin, so that's 67% of people agreed with statement A. So people want to see government make major housing investments, even if it means increasing the deficit. That includes 79% of Democrats, 76% of independents, and 49% of Republicans. So again, half of Republicans say that they want major housing investments, even if it means increasing the deficit. So this is significant, right? The American people as a whole don't think it's a particularly good time to worry about the federal deficit right now, and even Republicans are evenly divided on that. In terms of specific policies, how do people feel about the policy solutions that Diane talked about earlier? Turns out there is near universal support for our urgent priorities. 93% favor providing emergency rental assistance during the outbreak, 90% favor expanding funding for homeless assistance, 89% favor enacting a national policy that stops all evictions, which in our lingo is a moratorium. But beyond these urgent priorities, COVID-19 has really changed the way that people think about housing investments over the long haul. So 86% of all voters say that the outbreak has demonstrated the need for long-term government investments in housing to ensure that we're prepared for the next crisis. So people really understand and embrace the idea that stable, affordable housing is actually going to make us more resilient going forward. So then we asked about a range of specific long-term solutions, things like creating a permanent emergency rental assistance program, similar to what was introduced last December in the Eviction Crisis Act from Senator Brown, Portman, Bennett, and Young. And so the idea here is that when you're in an economic shock, you're not dealing with this on an ad hoc basis, that there's a permanent emergency rental assistance program that's ready to respond. The public strongly supports this. We tested things like expanding the voucher program to scale so that everyone who qualifies for a voucher actually gets it. Today, only 1 out of 4 households that qualify actually get it because of chronic underfunding. The American people think we need to expand funding for this. We tested things like production programs so that we can build more affordable housing specifically for the lowest income people, programs like the National Housing Trust Fund. Increasing the supply is really critical. There's strong public support for that. There's strong public support for concepts like a renter's tax credit. So what's interesting is that we asked these questions about a year ago. In spring of 2019, we asked these same exact questions. There was pretty strong public support then. And post-COVID, this public support has ticked up rather significantly. So that was just a small sampling of all the polling results. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to our website, opportunityhome.org. It's the first thing you're going to see on the homepage. You can find the full questionnaire with all of the disaggregated results, fact sheet, the full PowerPoint deck. But in sum, it's really clear that people are really worried about housing right now. They want action in the next relief package. So in addition to being smart policy, as these poll results show, it's also really smart politics. So I'll turn it back over to Diane. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Chantal and Mike. And we are out of time, so I just want to leave everybody with a little bit more information about what's needed next, and really the question about why wouldn't we act now? The urgency couldn't be more clear, the stakes couldn't be higher, and the support from the public could barely be higher. So we need Congress to act urgently, immediately, as quickly as possible to prevent these tremendously harmful outcomes that we will otherwise have when the eviction tsunami arrives on our shores. So as a reminder, we are urging Congress to implement a uniform national moratorium on evictions for the duration of the pandemic. And there is legislation in the Senate and the House to do just that. It is S4097 and HR 7402. We are urging Congress to provide at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. And the legislation in the Senate is S3685, and in the House it's HR 6820. And we are urging $11.5 billion in emergency resources for people experiencing homelessness. In the Senate, the bill is 3856. In the House, it's HR 6724. All of these provisions are included in the HEROES Act. Also in the HEROES Act, which we are also urging be enacted, is at least $13 billion in additional funds to ensure housing stability. So if you are a staff member on the Hill, please take this information to your boss and urge them to act, to co-sponsor each of these individual bills, and most essentially now to urge leadership to include these priorities in a final spending package. If you're not a member of the staff on the Hill, call your member of Congress right now and urge them to act. The stakes couldn't be higher. The time is running out, but we still have time to stop this wave of eviction. So thank you all. Many, many thanks to all of our great speakers for joining today and for the work that they do in their communities every day. And thanks to all of you who have joined this conversation today. Thank you.